All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Patty Ferris-Vazidis. I serve as the Assistant Director of ADAPT, which stands for Division for Advancing Prevention and Treatment. We serve as the National Training and Technical Assistance Support Division for the National HIDA Program Office, supporting the 33 HIDAs across the United States. For those who are newer to HIDAs, that stands for High Intensity Drug Trafficking Areas. So we're super excited to have you join us today for what we know is going to be an incredibly useful webinar on how to balance adaptation and fidelity when implementing prevention programs. I want to give you just a quick background as to how we came around to this topic and why we're having this particular focus area today. So you all know, those of you who have worked with ADAPT in the past and come to any of our webinars or training or event functions in the past, that we put a lot out there on fundamentals of substance use prevention, as well as really work to help prevention practitioners and how to identify, select, implement, and evaluate prevention programs and prevention strategies. We've even done a little bit of work on how you do that in a way and how you understand application while also paying attention to sort of the local community and local context. And through our individual technical assistance, as well as our webinars and trainings that we've delivered, we continue to hear this common theme and this concern of not really exactly sure how to fit these evidence-based programs and strategies with our specific, unique community features, demographics, context, whatever it may be. And a lot of question around how do I do that when there may not be a best fit or a best match that's currently available out there. And the good news is prevention and implementation scientists have been studying this and generated best practice guidelines to help support that decision-making process, to really ground you in staying and maintaining fidelity to core components of a program or strategy, while also making thoughtful and meaningful adaptations that are going to make it maximally fit and most effective in your unique settings. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today. We're very excited to have a subject matter expert in this area, Dr. Brittany Cooper, here to go through that with us. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started, just to get those out of the way. I'm sure you are all Zoom ninjas by now, and you're used to these webinars, but just so you are aware, because we sometimes hold meetings and we sometimes hold webinars, this is a webinar. So by default, your video is turned off and your sound is muted. You're not going to be able to chat from attendee to attendee, but you can chat with us, and we're going to ask you to do that a number of times during the webinar today. Dr. Cooper is going to be asking you all to give your thoughts and input, and that's going to help sort of guide the direction forward. So definitely use that chat feature for those moments. Any thoughts that you have. You'll also notice, in addition to the chat, you have a Q&A. We'll have dedicated moments of Q&A. So if you have something that's a little bit more appropriate to a question, we ask you to really put that in that Q&A so it doesn't get lost as the chat really kind of lights up with your responses to some of the targeted questions that are going to be asked to you. This is going to be recorded, and the recording is going to be made available to everybody. By the end of the week, you'll receive a recording as well as a resource supplement that corresponds to today's event. That'll include handouts of the slides, as well as some resources that are going to be discussed and presented today and recommended by the presenter. One last thing, when we do close the webinar, a post-presentation evaluation is going to pop up. We would really appreciate your input on that. And also, for those who are interested in receiving 1.5 free continuation credits for today's event, when you complete that post-presentation evaluation, you'll be prompted to put in your name and email as you want your name presented on your certificate and your email to where you want it sent to, and we'll be processing those over the course of the next few days. So with that, it is my honor to introduce Dr. Brittany Cooper, who is our presenter for today. Dr. Cooper is an associate professor of human development, a youth and family extension specialist, and graduate faculty in the prevention science doctoral program at Washington State University. Her research, teaching, outreach all center around translating prevention science for public health impact. And over the last decade, she's done a lot of work collaborating with federal, state, and other community stakeholders to help improve the field's understanding of how to best support evidence-based prevention programs in diverse community settings. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Cooper to carry us forward.
Thank you so much, Patty. Let me just bring my slides up quickly and switch settings. There we go. So you should see the first slide, title slide here. Thank you so much to Patty and Laura for inviting me to today's session. This is a topic that I think a lot about and care a lot about, so I'm really excited to be here to share my experience with this, but also learn from you all in your experience. I know you bring a lot to the table as well. So thank you, Patty, for that lovely introduction. I'm also curious to know who's in the room here. So if you wouldn't mind, I would love for you to share just your name, your location, organization, and then take a quick look at this cartoon. You might have seen something like this before. And so I would love for you to just take a minute to reflect on kind of your work in the prevention field and how this strikes you today, maybe based on what you've been working on currently. So I'll go ahead and read out to you what I see here on the cartoon as you guys are introducing yourselves in the chat box. So this cartoon says, "Today I'm here with the heroic people of the village of Downstream to hear their incredible story. Many years ago, we noticed that growing numbers of people were caught in the river's swift current. So in order to save them, we built a hospital by the edge of the water, a fleet of rescue boats ready for service, and we now have dozens of dedicated lifeguards ready to risk their lives to save people." And the woman says, "Amazing, congrats. And why were people falling in the river in the first place?" Someone hadn't thought about that. But I know all of you here, if you're in the prevention field, probably think about this a lot. So just curious if you have any reactions or thoughts, feel free to share those in the chat box as well. I love to see the various places people are coming from. I'm here in Pullman, Washington, in the eastern side of Washington State. I know we have just a wide variety of diverse folks and organizations represented. I see some coalitions, technical assistance centers. Let's see, yeah, Center for Prevention and Counseling, great. Yeah, some folks who have seen this cartoon and appreciate it, and it really resonates. I love to see that. Yeah, great. Well, thank you again so much for providing these introductions. It's really nice. You know, it's hard because I can't see you all there. You can see me, but I can't see your faces. So this is the best we can do to feel a little bit more connected. Great. Thank you. Well, you can feel free to continue doing that. I feel like Patty kind of already set the stage so well. This is going to be maybe a little bit of repetitive, but I always like to start these sessions with kind of grounding us in a story. So a common story in prevention, if you're in this field, is that we work really, really hard to get funding to implement some kind of evidence-based program or practice that we think is really going to help our community. So we work really hard, nose to the grindstone to write those grants, and we might, you know, get a grant, and we're excited. We got the grant, we're going to implement this evidence-based program. And then the hard work begins, right? Then we stop and might think, well, wait a second. This evidence-based program may need a little bit of tweaking to make this work really in our community. And that's kind of what Patty was referring to earlier. And then we might be like, oh gosh, how are we going to do that? We need to make some really tough choices. We want to stay true to that original program because there's some research to support that it's worked. But we also really want to stay true to our community and the needs of our community and the needs of the people we work with. And so we want to find that right balance. And that's really what today's session is all about. The end goal is that I hope that you'll leave today's session feeling like this, feeling like you've conquered that really, really hard hike up the mountain. And you can say to yourself, I have the tools I need to determine when and how to make thoughtful adaptations while still maintaining fidelity. I'm confident I can implement my program with fidelity and fit my community's needs. That's really the key. So, but just as a baseline, just to kind of start us out, I'm curious if you look at this statement right now, where you're at in your own work, based on your experiences, you know, for how many of you do you feel really confident that this statement is true? And how many do you feel maybe not so sure and this statement might be more false for you? So if Patty could bring up the first poll, this is a nice way to help me too get a sense for kind of what you're bringing to today's session and how we can meet your needs. So if you had to answer this statement right now, would you say this statement is true or false for you? So give people a little bit of time to answer that. Got about 50% of folks who've responded. Trying for at least a 75% response rate. As a researcher, response rates are really important. Okay. We're about there. You can go ahead and stop the poll and show the results. Okay. So it looks like we're about half and half. Okay, so half folks come to this session, you're feeling really confident. Maybe you'll get some additional tools for your tool belt moving forward. And maybe hopefully we can learn from you all about your experience and what's worked for you. For the other half of us, we might be a little less sure, and hopefully by the end of today, you'll be feeling a lot more confident. So great, thank you so much. And I think, Patty, were you going to share those results? I can't tell if they're on the screen or not, but you can trust me. It's about half and half.
Yes, they were up, and okay. Now I've taken them down so we can move forward.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. More specifically, I have kind of three main objectives for today's session. One, I'm really aiming to try to increase your understanding, if you don't already have a good understanding of what the research is saying on these topics of evidence-based program implementation, fidelity, and adaptation, especially how all of those pieces kind of fit together. I'm also going to dive into these 5 best practices that come from the research on how to balance evidence-based prevention program fidelity and adaptation, really aimed at improving and achieving positive outcomes. And then finally, I want you to kind of take your knowledge of those best practices and really begin thinking about how can this apply to what my work is in my setting, how these tools and strategies can be used. And I'm going to provide an example for how a group that I'm working with has used these strategies in the past and continues to use it. So that's the goal today. The way we're going to get there is I'm going to start by trying to set the stage with some core terms, a review of the research, and specifically 4 different research-based frameworks or models that kind of contribute different pieces to this puzzle. Part 2 is where I'm going to introduce those tools and strategies, and have no fear, there's going to be a lot presented, a lot of different tools and strategies, links to other resources, but as Patty said, you'll get the copy of the slides, so you'll have hyperlinks to all the things that I'm going to share today. And then finally, I'll provide you with that example and talk more concretely about how to apply these best practices in real life. So without further ado, we'll move into part number 1, defining core terms and reviewing the research. So you're probably pretty familiar with these terms, implementation, fidelity, adaptation, but you may or may not have kind of concrete definitions in your head for each of them. So that's what I'm going to share with you next, just so we're all kind of on the same page. So when we're talking about implementation, first thing to note is that it consists of multiple dimensions. It's not one thing, but it's also a process. So there might be kind of components of implementation, but really importantly, it's a process of integrating a program into a particular setting. Then when we're talking about fidelity, this is the extent to which an evidence-based program was delivered as planned, meaning it's representing kind of the quality and integrity of the evidence-based program as conceived by the original program developers. And then finally, when we talk about adaptation, adaptation is the degree to which that evidence-based program is changed to fit the setting or to improve fit to local conditions. So you can already start to see overlap and kind of connections between these 3 core terms or concepts. But as we talk about the different research frameworks I'm going to share with you in just a bit, you'll start to see even more clearly how they relate to one another. I also want to just make a note here that adaptation can include or does include a specific type of adaptation, cultural adaptation, which is the process of adapting interventions to a specific cultural group. That's not the primary focus of today's presentation, although I will say that a lot of the best practices I think still apply when you're trying to make cultural adaptations. I will recommend a few resources and specific readings if you're interested in learning more specifically about cultural adaptation at the end of today's presentation. Okay, so as I mentioned, the first start to all of this is understanding what these core components are, or these core terms are, these different pieces of the puzzle. But I would say within the last 10 years, our understanding of these concepts in the research has really improved quite a bit, and our thinking about how they fit together, how to kind of work with all of them has really changed. But, again, 10 years ago or so, there were folks that were talking about fidelity and adaptation as 2 ends of a spectrum. And really, I think most people at this point now understand that that's not true, that they're not, it's not one or the other, it's not one versus the other. But it's important that we kind of start grounding ourselves in understanding why people might kind of pit them against each other in order to kind of get past that. So I want to cover what, again, which isn't kind of current thinking, I would say, not what the research is currently saying, but it used to. Like, it used to say, okay, you're either on the fidelity side of this argument or you're on the adaptation side. And so the fidelity side of the argument really says, well, it's best not to tinker with a proven effective program. This program's been rigorously tested in strong evaluations, been developed with strong theory. So really, we can't tinker with it much because it might not have the same outcomes. If we're making changes, we can't be assured that we're going to achieve the same outcomes that the research has shown the program to work with. And then finally, we should take advantage of the researchers or the program developers' expertise about the evidence-based program. So we want to trust in their process and what they've developed because they've shown it to be effective. So that's the fidelity side of the argument. The other side of the argument is, well, in reality, adaptations are going to happen. When you transport a program that's developed with one specific population in one specific setting, you take it out of that context and try to implement it somewhere else, the reality is adaptation happens. So we should just accept it. And programs often should be adapted or need to be adapted to meet the unique conditions and needs of the local community. And finally, it's really important to also trust and rely on practitioners' expertise about the local community. They understand a lot about how their community works, how the individuals in that community might perceive a particular program or approach. And so that should inform the implementation of that program in that setting. So those are kind of the two sides to the quote unquote argument, fidelity versus adaptation argument. But again, today what we're talking about is really finding a balance. So how do we find that balance? And this is where I want to share with you some of the work that's been done recently in the prevention science and implementation science research. And specifically, I'm going to talk about these 4 different models or frameworks that help try to kind of better understand how these pieces fit together. So starting off with the first framework about implementation stages and drivers. So when we're first thinking about implementation, it's important to recognize and think about it as the fact it's a process, right? We talked about that earlier. So thinking about the stages can be helpful when figuring out how these different concepts kind of fit together. So according to this model, implementation takes place across 4 stages and often spans between 2 and 4 years to get all the way from exploration all the way through full implementation. So I'm going to share in just a bit kind of the details that go, what happens within each of these stages, but I know many of you out there are very experienced in implementing an evidence-based program. So I just wanted to throw a question out there for you to answer in the chat box. Based on your experience, where do decisions about fidelity and adaptation take place? Which stage or stages in your experience do those kind of discussions happen? Where you're trying to figure out, how do we maintain fidelity and how do we adapt or meet the needs of our local community or make changes that meet the needs of our local community. So if you had to say, which stage or stages do you think this happens in? Okay, so I see exploration coming up, installation. Chris is saying throughout all the stages. Yep, any of the stages. Ramona is saying exploration preferably, but really it happens throughout. Yeah, exactly. So I think you guys are hitting it right on nail on the head. I had no doubt. We've got some experienced people here. Is that you at least want to start thinking about these ideas or these concepts right at the beginning when you're exploring what kinds of programs might meet your needs. But really, truthfully, you're going to have to think about it throughout because you're learning different things throughout this process. And so as we talk about the best practices, you'll start to see how these things play out and how they can inform different stages of implementation. Great. So let's just share a little bit more detail what happens at each of these stages. So, in exploration, as you might expect, the focus here is placed on assessing the needs of the community to make sure those needs match the components of the evidence-based program that you're selecting. Also, at the same time, you're starting to consider possible challenges to implementation. That's probably where those considerations between fidelity and adaptation can happen as well. During this stage, this framework also talks about the importance of what they call implementation drivers and thinking about those, as well as program fit being assessed at this stage. So implementation drivers, according to this work, these are the types of things that help ensure high fidelity, so kind of implementing the program as it was originally designed, and it helps facilitate the success of program implementation and outcomes according to this framework. In a little bit, I'm going to share with you specific examples of what those drivers are, and we can think a little bit more about that. During installation, this is where you're helping to prepare the organization for program implementation. So you're acquiring resources that are needed to implement the program. You're training up your staff or your facilitators and getting prepared. Then in initial implementation, this is the point at which you're first delivering the program to participants, and you're starting to figure out what's working, what's not. You're trying out your skills if you're a facilitator for the first time and it's a new program. And so again, this question of fidelity versus adaptation is likely to come up here, because it's one thing to read about a program or even get trained in a program. It's another thing when you actually start delivering it to an actual live group of people. And so you might learn some things in that process that make you consider potentially other issues related to fidelity and adaptation. And then finally, if you hopefully reach stage 4, where that's considered full implementation, you've had some experience implementing this program and really integrating it into the organization, into the community, and continuing to monitor outcomes, evaluate if the program's working, and that also could provide you with some valuable information related to fidelity and adaptation. Okay, so as I mentioned previously, implementation drivers help ensure high fidelity and facilitate success of the program, and they're important at all stages of implementation. So I just wanted to share with you, at least according to this body of research, what are the 3 types of implementation drivers. So we have on the left side of the triangle, competency drivers. These are the kinds of skills and capacities related to selecting the right kind of program for your community, getting training, coaching, monitoring fidelity. All of these competency drivers help develop, improve, and sustain the practitioner's ability to implement the program as intended with fidelity, according to this framework. Then we have organizational drivers on the right-hand side of the triangle. This includes the different aspects of the organization, the systems, that can help create a hospitable organizational environment for this particular program, for delivering effective programs in general. Then at the base of the triangle, we have leadership. That's also been shown to be a key here, really foundational. It includes both technical leadership support, so helping resolve problems when they arise. This also could be related to, problems related to implementation, problems related to maintaining fidelity, and also adaptive leadership support. This is really, this is when, uncertain problems come up and you have to be really creative in identifying solutions. So that forms our kind of triangle of implementation drivers. This framework suggests that these drivers should be integrated with one another and can compensate when some are weak and others are stronger. They can compensate for those, strengths and weaknesses. And they also represent the core aspects of the capacity needed to facilitate sustained use of the intervention and therefore, according to this framework, improve outcomes. But this is a session about fidelity and adaptation, but this framework really focuses on fidelity, right? There's not even the word adaptation included. So you might ask yourself, well, where does adaptation fit in? And I asked that same question. So if I had to kind of modify this, I would do this, that really these drivers should be focusing on not solely implementing the program with strict fidelity, but finding a way to balance fidelity and adaptation. And then if you do that, not only are you going to, that's not only going to result in consistent use and implementation of the innovation or intervention, but that it's going to meet the community's needs. And that's really critical for improving outcomes. So that's our first framework or model to be kind of thinking about to help inform this discussion of balancing fidelity and adaptation. I'm going to move on to the second one. So another view of kind of this balance between program fidelity and program adaptation can be seen in Kemp's recipe analogy. So according to Kemp, if you're an expert cake baker, remember this is an analogy, so cake baker, you can think of maybe as representing a program developer. You're an expert cake baker, you might want to use, if you're not an expert cake baker, you might want to use the off-the-shelf plain vanilla or plain chocolate cake mix as the foundation to your recipe. There's a core set of ingredients, methods, equipment outlined by the cake mix that if you implement it with quality and fidelity, following the steps, adding all the ingredients in the right measurements, in the right order, that you're going to come out with a great tasting cake. However, you may also need to adapt or modify the basic recipe to be more compatible with the ingredients, the methods, and the equipment available to you in your community, in your setting, in your grocery store. And so you also may want to add or enhance them depending on the tastes of the people whom you're baking the cake for. That's where the variation recipe comes in. That's where the fancier strawberry yogurt cake recipe, the add-ons, the additions, the enhancements, or the quote unquote adaptation. So this is another way to start thinking about fidelity and adaptation, and to think about how they can go alongside each other. They're not necessarily competing against each other. So to drive this point home a little bit more and maybe more concretely, this analogy was developed by Kemp and her colleagues to support an understanding of how to adapt to local context and maintain program fidelity of a particular early childhood home visiting program. This program was being adopted and implemented in 18 sites across Australia, the UK, and South Korea, so quite different contexts. And so that's what you see represented here in this graphic. On the left-hand side, you see examples from the project of the ingredients, methods, and equipment needed to implement the home visiting program, or the fidelity, kind of the core components that all sites needed to be implementing. On the right-hand side, you see variations in these different components that different sites incorporated. These are the adaptations. So generally, what we're talking about when we're talking about quote unquote core ingredients, these are the components of the evidence-based program that are primarily responsible for producing positive participant changes that you're aiming to achieve. This may be core content of the curriculum or required facilitator training. If you leave one of those out, your cake won't taste very good. The core method is the way we bring these ingredients together, and that's also is also critical for fidelity and achievement of outcomes. So for the cake analogy, this might be mixing the liquid ingredients together before adding to the dry ingredients. For an evidence-based program, the method is how the program is being delivered. Is it a group format? Is it an individual format? Are the lessons delivered in a specific sequence? These are all core kind of methods by which the program is delivered. Then we have the core equipment. This helps support the actions needed to enact the method and the core ingredients. So for the cake analogy, this would include things like you need mixing bowls, and maybe you need cake tins of a particular size, you need wooden spoons or a mixer. In the evidence-based program example or kind of analogy, that the equipment needed may be more or less available in different communities. And so it's important to consider when the program is a good match for a specific organization prior to implementing it. So can they find the correct equipment to bring all these core pieces together to make this program happen? So although there can be modifications to these core elements, as much as possible, they should be delivered as outlined in the established recipe, i.e. fidelity. And when adaptations are needed, they should be made using best practices. That's what we're going to talk about a little bit later. But generally, variations aim to maintain or enhance the core program goals and theory. So it's critical when you're implementing a program that you really understand those core program goals and theory. They give thought to both philosophical questions like, is the variation consistent with the underlying program theory, as I just mentioned, as well as logistical, because that's really critical too, right? Can this variation be accomplished given the capacity that we have in this community with this organization, this local site? So kind of those are the two aspects of the variations or the adaptations that you want to be thinking about. Okay, so this is a good time. I've been talking at you a lot. Let's stop a second and reflect. Based on your experiences, I'd like you to share just a little bit in the chat box. Think about a program you've recently implemented or you're thinking of implementing. What would you consider kind of those core ingredients, those things that if left out, your cake recipe would fail or your program would fail, as well as maybe some variations that you're envisioning or that you use to help enhance or maintain the goals of the program while still meeting the community's needs. So I know that's a lot, but if things jump to mind, based on your experiences, I'd love to hear a couple. Yeah, I appreciate that comment, Claudia. So the idea that some of these programs were developed a long time ago. The research was done maybe a long time ago, and so they feel outdated. So that can be really challenging. So I'd be curious if you kind of have any ideas for how programs, you still might be able to maintain some core elements of that program, but bring it a bit up to date. That might be your variation. Yeah, so Kara mentioned, I think what would be a variation or maybe an adaptation, adding more activities to get to know students, build relationships. So maybe a core element or kind of goal of the program is to create rapport with the students, right? That's really important, building those relationships. So you might find ways, variations to add to enhance that piece of the program. Great. Yeah, so Amy Miller, thanks for sharing that example related to Strengthening Families program. You'll see Strengthening Families come up again in my example, you know, that there might be specific curriculum weekly goals and objectives, but the current activities designed for the youth, they might be outdated. They might not resonate with the youth anymore, but you still try to, you might want to modify or add activities that still focus on those goals and themes, but enhance them. Yeah, great. So awesome examples that you're sharing. I really appreciate those, and I hope your colleagues will kind of read through these as well to get their own kind of thoughts flowing, ideas flowing. It's a great list. Awesome, thank you. Thanks for sharing that. So that brings us to a third way of thinking about these concepts. So now that we have a way to think about fidelity and adaptation using the recipe analogy, I want to share another model that helps us think through how these aspects of implementation are related to outcomes, to participant outcomes, to program outcomes. So Burkell's integrated model of program implementation is based on a review of the research, examining how different aspects of implementation predict positive program and participant outcomes. And they show, on average, those programs implemented with high fidelity have positive outcomes. On average, those delivered with high quality, probably not surprisingly, also you know, tend to show better outcomes. Those programs that use adaptation best practices also more likely to show positive outcomes. So these are all probably all make sense to you, have, you know, it's kind of intuitive that these would matter. But my question is, this isn't the full picture. And I'm going to share the full picture in the next slide. But in your opinion, based on your experience, what other factors are important to consider and that lead to positive program and participant outcomes? So fidelity is important. High quality implementation is important. You know, making adaptations thoughtfully is important. What else is missing from this picture in your experience? What other things really matter? Oh, you can't see what others post. That's a bummer. I'm sorry, you guys. I'm getting to see all your awesome responses. And it sounds like you're not. I'll try to share out some examples. Yeah, so Kelly's sharing another aspect that's really important is flexibility of the facilitator. Probably having a really experienced facilitator can be more flexible. Someone who's well-trained and maybe has more experience. Amanda's pointing out community input as being really important. Daphne is saying participant feedback. Kevin's agreeing flexibility is really important to being an effective teacher. Kara's pointing out having cultural competency is really important as well. Having readiness, participants being ready to participate in the program. Knowing your audience, their background knowledge, and their learning needs and adapting to that. That's awesome example. In fact, it aligns very well with my next point. So I'm going to go ahead and share the full picture here. So not only did Burkell find that these aspects individually were important, certainly in combination, they're really important. And especially when these aspects lead to more positive participant engagement with the program. So what her model suggests is that when we're thinking about maintaining fidelity, when we're thinking about how we're delivering the program or how the quality of the implementation, when we're thinking about making adaptations, if we keep in the center of our mind, is this improving or enhancing participant engagement? If it is, then likely those kinds of things are going to improve outcomes, because we can't be effective if our participants aren't, if the material's not resonating with them and if they're not engaging with the material. Now, engagement can mean a lot of different things in different types of programs. So again, another chat box. what does positive participant engagement look like? How do you know your participants are engaged? And then if you take it a step further, how could you make an adaptation to improve or increase engagement in your experience with your particular program? Oh, thanks, Patty. She changed the function, so you should be able to see everyone's response. So what do you guys think? So based on your experience with your various programs, how do you know you're seeing engagement in your participants? What does that look like? They're asking questions. So you might be actually surveying your participants, Amy's saying, so that you could ask questions about, how well the material is resonating, or, how satisfied they are with the material. Good. Yeah, they're coming back to the program. Good point, Barbara. So retention of participants, seeing people want to keep coming back and make it all the way through all the sessions. Asking questions, right? So if you think about these examples of what participant engagement looks like, can you make any even hypotheses or brainstorm some ideas on how you might enhance that engagement? So the example of people coming back to your program, right? They come to one session and they want to come back to the next. Are there ways that you could increase the likelihood that they come back to that next session and make it all the way through the program? Those are the kinds of enhancements or adaptations that you likely, yeah, Wendy, providing food is definitely a big one, that you could make to your program, even if it's not, technically a part of your curriculum or program you're delivering. Maybe it's a little outside of what the program is trying to do, but if you're adding those things, that's likely to lead to positive outcomes. Incentives, gift cards, yeah, exactly. Great. So again, we're just trying to get you thinking about what kinds of adaptations might make the most positive impacts. Okay, so finally, we made it to number 4, almost all the way through the researchy stuff. So the next model I want to share with you is the newest one. And I happen to know the folks who developed this one, and I've done some work with them. What this model is trying to do is focus more specifically on the different types of adaptations. Not every adaptation is equated equal, right, or is equal. And so they might have, it's trying to get you to think through what are the characteristics of adaptations, what different types of adaptations might be more likely to have positive outcomes, and other types that are likely to have more negative outcomes. So they break this down into 3 domains, and I know the language on here definitely sounds a little bit, I don't know, researchy, if you will, but I'll try to provide you with some examples. So the 3 domains are, first, the characteristics of the adaptation. Like I said, not all adaptations are created equal. If they were, we wouldn't have to have a session like this. So they have us thinking about, there we go, different questions to ask ourselves. So what is modified? That's one aspect of adaptation. Is the content modified? Is the delivery, the way the program's being delivered, modified? Was the training modified? So there are lots of different places where you could make modifications or adaptations. So that's one question. Then they say, well, what's the nature of the adaptation? So what they mean by that is, are you adding things? Are you skipping things? Are you substituting things? Are you shortening things, lengthening things? So you can start to see that, again, the types of adaptations or the different dimensions of adaptations, there's just a lot of different ways you could go. Who participated in deciding to make that adaptation? So did you have program leaders help you make that decision? Maybe the trainers of the original program or the developers of the program? Are funders involved in that conversation, administration? So just thinking about who participated in that decision-making process is helpful. And then for whom is the adaptation made? Are you trying to adapt to a specific target population, a specific community setting, a specific organization? So thinking about that is helpful. And then when did the adaptation occur? Did it happen in that exploration stage, or did it happen only after you implemented the program once and then you realized something didn't work and you needed to make an adaptation? So again, these are all different aspects of adaptation that they say are important, and the research is starting to support are critical to understanding how they're going to impact outcomes, because that's the goal here. The next domain that they talk about are mediation or moderating factors. It's not critical that you understand what those words mean. They're kind of a statistical concept. Basically, what they're trying to do is say, we think that adaptation characteristics are going to impact outcomes, but how and why? And we want to understand this domain too, because that's really the crux of it. You know, why are these adaptations leading to negative outcomes? Why are they leading to more positive outcomes? Understanding that can really help us be better decision makers when we're trying to balance fidelity and adaptation. So the kinds of things you ask yourself here are the adaptations consistent with the core functions or the underlying program theory that we talked about earlier? Is the adaptation made for a reason that addresses fit? You know, increasing the fit between the program and the audience, or the program and the organization's capacity. Was the adaptation made with consideration of impact on outcomes? And were they made using a systematic process, or was it pretty, you know, willy-nilly? And was the adaptation made due to an anticipated obstacle, or, you know, an actual obstacle that you've experienced? And then just to point out the fact in domain 3 that, first of all, you might have intended outcomes, things that you're trying to do, but you also want to be thoughtful about the potential unintended consequences of making these adaptations. So they talk about the fact that there are multiple outcomes that you're after. Program outcomes would be things like actually adopting a particular program, or the acceptability of the program, or the cost of the program. So you might make adaptations that reduce the cost, or you might make adaptations that increase acceptability. But then you want to think about, well, wait, how does that affect program outcomes? So you've got to be thinking about multiple types of outcomes when you're thinking about how you're making these decisions between adaptation, you know, balancing that fidelity and adaptation. So I know that's a lot, but what I really love about this model in particular is that they also accompany it with a decision-making guide. So this is one that will come up again when I'm sharing my example, but this is the basics of the decision-making guide, again, based in research evidence to this point on how we understand these things. So what they found is that evidence suggests that non-systematic adaptations, those made without a particular goal in mind, those that compromise core functions, are associated with negative impact on outcomes, probably not surprisingly. So what they did is they said, let's have two main questions that we're asking ourselves. First, is my adaptation systematic, designed with a goal in mind, aligned with core functions? If the adaptation is non-systematic, not aligned with core functions, or made without a clear goal, it's more likely to have a negative outcome. Again, not surprisingly. So if you find yourself questioning whether it's systematic, designed with a goal in mind, or aligned with core functions, you might want to stop there and discuss the pros and cons of that adaptation with your key stakeholders, and consider potentially abandoning it or redesigning the adaptation and reconsidering. On the other hand, if you can answer this question with a yes, they encourage you to think about the potential negative impacts the adaptation might have, intended or not, on the different outcomes that we're trying to achieve. What's interesting about this is that they suggest even if the answer to this question is yes, or sorry, if the answer to this question is no, you can proceed with the adaptation. They encourage you to describe it, document it, and then monitor its impact. But even if the answer to this question is yes, there's still another question to ask yourself. Can you mitigate that negative impact or offset it with positive impact on other outcomes? So we mentioned the idea of cost. Cost can be a big challenge sometimes. So maybe you're trying to make adaptations to an intervention that reduce the cost. Well, that might have an unintended consequence on some other type of important outcome. Like maybe it reduces the acceptability of that program for a particular audience. So you might try to, if you think that's really critical of reducing the cost, but it's going to have an effect on acceptability, you might try to think of strategies to offset that unintended negative consequence on acceptability by including some kind of strategy to increase buy-in as a part of implementing this particular program. So there are lots of other examples you could think through, but what I like about this is that it's not a complete black and white. I guess I don't know if I like it, but it's the reality, right? It's not black or white. There are these gray areas, and I think it's really important to be nuanced about this. It's not easy, and that's why we have to be really thoughtful and think in strategic and systematic ways about what we're trying to do. So if you can, or you don't think there are negative impacts, they suggest obviously proceeding, so I'll add that other arrow, proceeding with the adaptation and encouraging you to monitor it. The other thing they really point out here, oh, sorry, the other question here, if you answer no to that, then similarly, you want to discuss the pros and cons, consider abandoning or redesigning the adaptation. The final piece is they say, this is a process and it's an iterative process. You're probably going to want to kind of cycle back through these questions as you continue to move through the different stages of implementation. All right, so that brings us to the end of this section. We're going to move on in just a second into some of those strategies and tools. But before we leave this section, I thought it might be a nice opportunity to reflect. So I often do this with my courses that I teach and other things I facilitate. We do the shape up reflection. So the first question is just to reflect on what squared with you about the research we just reviewed or the frameworks. What kind of just resonated with you based on your experience? Kind of making these decisions related to fidelity and adaptation. So again, I would love to see folks in the chat box. So Heather really appreciated the decision-making chart, kind of a step-by-step guide. All right, summary of what you've been doing for so long with a few ideas. That's great. Yeah, I know we have an experienced audience here. Yeah, that making adaptations can be effective, can improve even your outcomes sometimes. That's great. Yeah. You know, these other questions might kind of be similar, or your answers might be similar. Yeah, the recipe analogy is on point. Thanks. You know, what points do you want to remember from the research we reviewed? What do you want to take away from this? Might be similar to some of the things you're sharing. But I'm going to click past that because I'm curious if there are still questions circling in your mind about things that we reviewed. And that'll help me as we move forward into the other sections to make sure we try to hit on those questions you might have. So what questions do you still have, you know, based on what we've talked about so far? Feel free to drop those in the chat box right now, or you can add them to the Q&A. We can make sure we get to them at some point. But any questions that are kind of out there right now? Nancy just asked a maybe clarifying question about domain 3 in the last session, in the last model that we shared. And domain 3 was the outcomes, the different types of outcomes, both in terms of the program itself, things like cost of the program, feasibility of the program, acceptability, and then the participants' actual outcomes related to the delivery of the program. Yeah, thanks. Okay, well, I want to share 3 key points that I'm taking away from this section, or that I hope that you take away from this section too. The idea that adaptations can occur within the context of low fidelity or high fidelity, right? They're not necessarily always competing against each other. Not all adaptations deviate from the program's original design and theory. In fact, many of them can enhance and build upon that original design and theory. And then it really is possible to make thoughtful adaptations while maintaining fidelity. So hopefully those are some key points that you also took away from this. I'm going to move us forward into part number 2 for today's session, and that's where I'm going to introduce to you some research-based tools and strategies. I'm going to point you to this one to start, because this is one that I developed with some colleagues. And I encourage you can use the QR code, or if Patty has a chance and can drop the link into the chat box, you can use that. Of course, you'll get this information as well. But this is a document. It's a fairly short, I think 4-page document that helps describe 5 different best practices that we're going to go over today, and also provide some case examples and kind of thought exercises to help you think about how you can apply these different best practices that I'm going to share with you in just a bit. So feel free to check that out. This slide shows the 5 best practices. So number 1, selecting an evidence-based program that meets your needs, determining core elements that make the EBP effective, assessing the need for adaptation, adapting using best practices, and then finally developing a continuous quality improvement plan. So I'm going to ask for poll number 2 next. Without knowing anything about these best practices besides their names or their titles, which best practice do you feel most confident about right now? So I'm going to force you to choose just one. What do you feel most confident about of these 5? And then it looks like the second question is up too. So the second question is, which best practice do you feel least confident about? So take a minute to respond to that poll. All right, I'm looking for that 75% response rate. I'm only at about 40 right now, so give you guys a minute or two more. Okay, almost there. We got about 2/3. This is interesting. Seems like there's more commonality in what you're confident about and more variety in what you're least confident about. Let's see. Okay, I think that's good. Why don't we go ahead and stop the poll and share the results? So it looks like most of you feel fairly confident about selecting an evidence-based program that meets your needs, and maybe a little less confident about some of the other components. So there's a little bit more diversity there. Great, wonderful. You can stop sharing then. All right, so hopefully, again, by the end of this, you'll have a little bit more confidence in all these areas. So you feel confident about this, so this shouldn't be maybe unfamiliar. When you're thinking about adaptation and fidelity, the first step is you want to find a program that best meets your needs, the one that you're going to have to make the fewest adaptations to, right? So you want to ask questions like, are the targeted outcomes relevant and acceptable for my community, my organization, my particular target population? Is there strong evidence with my particular audience that I'm trying to reach? Many of these programs were developed, as mentioned, many years ago, and also often with mostly white, middle-class populations. And so that might not be the population I'm working with. Is you want to be thoughtful about how that evidence does or doesn't match your particular target population. You also want to think not only about the outcomes in the target audience, but the content of the actual curriculum or program, the methods that are being used to deliver it. Are those accessible? Do I have things in place that would allow me to do those things, deliver this particular program? And is it appealing and acceptable to the population or to the community or to my organization? So those are just some general questions that you want to ask yourself. I also really wanted to point you to this tool. There are several tools out there, but this has been one of my favorite to use over the years, developed by the National Implementation Research Network. They developed it originally for school administrators to think about implementing school-based programs, but it's really applicable to all types of programs. So I encourage you to check out this tool. It has you work through 6 different aspects of a program to consider the pros and cons to that program, whether or not it might meet your needs. So I'll leave you to do that on your own time. Moving on to the second best practice. So this is determining key program elements. So this part is kind of tough sometimes. One, ideally, you wouldn't necessarily have to figure this out on your own. You would have help from the original program developer, or at least their trainers or the organization that you're working with to learn more about a particular program from. But if you're not working with those people, if you don't have access to them, there are other ways to help focus in on or determine what might be the most important key program elements or ingredients, methods, and equipment, right? Going back to the analogy, that are really critical and you might want to consider not messing with too much. So, gathering the program materials, the facilitator guides, etc., statements of goals, a summary of the underlying theory, the facilitator guides, all of these things might give you clues into this. Ultimately, if you have a program logic model, that can also really help inform what the key elements are. And if you don't already have, there's not one existing, again, there are ways to develop it on your own based on the material that you have and your knowledge. I also want to point you to these other resources for other ways to think about identifying program elements, developing logic models. These are 2 really great resources for that. So moving on to best practice number 3, this is where we're assessing the need for adaptation. So certainly, I think most of us would agree that if you choose an evidence-based program, you think it meets your need, it meets all your criteria, then no need to adapt, right? But if you do, I encourage you to think through different aspects and identify whether there are mismatches or not between your program goal and objectives and your goals and objectives. The characteristics of your target population that the program was originally designed for versus your population you're working with. Similarly, aspects of the implementing organization or agency, characteristics of the community. So those are just a couple of examples of where you might want to kind of identify and categorize where there might be mismatches. And that'll kind of narrow you in on the types of adaptations or where you might want to make adaptations to improve the fit of that program with your needs and your community. So again, ideally, you would be doing this in consultation with an expert, the developer of the program, but often that's not feasible. So that's where the guidelines that I'm going to talk about next will really hopefully help you in this regard. Also wanted to point you to, and I'm going to come back to the CDC's Select, Adapt, Evaluate tool many times over. I think it's an excellent resource. And so it hits on many of these best practices that I'm going to talk about today. So definitely check out their website. It's a really kind of cool interactive website with some examples and walks you through a lot of these different aspects of these best practices. Okay, moving right ahead to best practice number 4. This is where you're actually going to make decisions about adapting the program. Another kind of tool or resource to be thinking about are, based on research and theory, we have some ideas about what might be more acceptable types of adaptations and more risky types of adaptations. And people have been talking about this now as kind of green light versus red light adaptations. And I'm going to share another resource in the next slide that kind of outlines those, as well as it provides a yellow light type of adaptation of what to do if you're in that yellow area. But in general, what the research would suggest is that you should try as much as possible to stay true to the duration of the intervention as it was originally designed, the intensity, and of course the key elements that we mentioned before, which hopefully you have already identified through that process that we talked about. So again, pointing you to some outside resources, that CDC's website has some good examples of green, yellow, and red light adaptations. And specifically, they're focused on violence prevention programs, but I think a lot of them would carry over to other types of programs, including substance use prevention programs. Then I'd also encourage you to use that alongside with that MADI decision-making guide that we walked through earlier, to ask yourself questions to consider when making those decisions. Okay, so like I promised, a nice little kind of schematic of green light adaptations, yellow light, and red light. So as you can see in this schematic, which comes from the National Cancer Institute, actually, that green light adaptations are usually pretty minor. It's pretty easy sometimes to categorize these because they're so minor that you really can't imagine them having a negative impact. They're also often focused on making changes to increase the reach, the receptibility, and the participation of the community or the participants that you're trying to target. So they might include changing the program name. Maybe just the name of the program itself you don't think is going to resonate. Updating relevant statistics or health information. Kind of getting to that discussion earlier of maybe the information in this curriculum was developed 10 years ago, so you want to update that information. Tailoring language, pictures, cultural scenarios, other things that you think might better match your target audience. They would suggest make those minor adaptations, especially if they're aimed at improving fit with your community setting and target population. Then we have yellow light, and this is a little bit harder to determine, but these are typically things that add or modify the intervention components and contents rather than deleting them. So you're not getting rid of anything, you're just trying to add things to enhance or maybe modify things slightly to improve them. So you can see the list of things that might include. It might include substituting activities, but activities that are still in line with the original intent. Maybe adding activities on top of the existing ones, that kind of thing. So these you want to proceed with caution if the adaptations don't interfere with the program theory or core components. Then finally, we have the red light adaptations. So these are things that change the core components of the intervention. Things like deleting entire sessions or components, cutting the program timeline, reducing it, reducing the dosage, things like that, where you really want to stop and try to avoid these adaptations if at all possible. So that's just a little bit more guidance on making those decisions. Again, we're going to share an example here in just a second that'll hopefully drive all these points home a little bit more. The last best practice is that you don't want to just stop once you've made your decision to adapt and implemented the adaptation. You really want to pay attention to, one, documenting what change you made and why you made it, discussing that with your group of implementers or the organization that you're working with, including monitoring and documenting Fidelity, the adaptations you made, monitoring that participant engagement piece, as well as outcomes. So we really encourage you to use implementation monitoring tools that might already be developed for your particular intervention, also staying up to date on any program revisions, that sort of thing. Again, the CDC resource has a couple of ideas too on how to monitor and document adaptations. Okay, so I breezed through those 5 best practices. So I'm just curious, based on, we're about 2/3 of the way through the material here. How are you feeling about this goal? Have we met this goal, or do we feel like this is true, or still you're not quite sure? So just curious. We were about half and half at the very beginning. Wondering if we've made progress. You can tell I'm a researcher, right? I'm constantly surveying you guys to get the numbers, to understand where we're at using data. Okay. All right. About half of you have participated. I'll give you a little bit longer. Want to make sure this is representative. Okay. All right, you can go ahead and stop the poll there. Thanks, Patty. I think we've made some progress. You can share the results. So about 88% of you that responded feel pretty confident right now, but there are still several of you who are not quite so sure. So I'm hoping that with this last part, it'll become even clearer and you'll feel even more confident with this. So go ahead and stop sharing. Great, thanks. That brings us to the last section of today's webinar. So this is where I'm going to provide you an example and discuss how we applied those best practices that I just mentioned. So I'll again share the best practices, but then give you an example of how we used that best practice in the context of our work. So to set the stage a little bit, so I've done a lot of work with the Strengthening Families program for parents and youth 10 to 14. So for those of you who might not be familiar with the program, it actually comes out of Iowa, was developed by researchers there. Washington State's been doing quite a lot of work with it for a long time. This program targets both middle school age youth and their caregivers, so it involves both of them. And it really is, it's a substance use prevention program, but really the focus is on improving communication and bonding, improving youth life skills, basically, parents' communication skills, that sort of thing. The context for this, the reason we started thinking about what we might want to do to adapt this program was the fact that, like in many states, Washington State was actually one of the first to legalize the use of cannabis by adults in 2012. We've been implementing this program for many, many years before that, since about 2000. So we have a long history, a lot of capacity to implement this program across Washington State. But this program wasn't developed or evaluated within the context of legalized cannabis use. As you know, attitudes, perspectives on cannabis use have changed drastically since, let's say, the early 1990s when this program was first developed. So that was the context for why we were thinking through and wanting to apply some of these best practices to this program. So again, these are the 5 best practices. We're going to walk through each one, and I'm going to tell you how we used it to guide our process, our decision making. Here are the questions that we considered in the context of this example. So, on the pro side, we thought, okay, SFP 10 to 14 has strong evidence of reducing alcohol, cigarette, and cannabis use in mostly white rural youth. That was the original research, was conducted in Iowa. And Washington State has a long history of successfully implementing this program with a variety of communities, including diverse communities outside of kind of the target population of the original program. So we feel pretty good about this program in general. We thought this is still a program that seems to meet our needs. But the con, as I mentioned, was that the program hasn't been tested in the context of legalized adult use of cannabis. And we've been hearing over time, caregivers expressing concerns about, how do I talk to my kids about cannabis? Because attitudes have changed so much. Perhaps me as an adult, I can use cannabis legally. How do I deal with that with my youth? Because I still don't want them using. So there's just a lot of things that we wanted to consider alongside the original program. So the next step, next best practice is determining key program elements. Again, point you to these tools. I'm going to share a little bit more detail about the CDC tool because I think it is so helpful in thinking just generally about trying to understand what are the key program elements. They break them up into what. So what are the skills, knowledge, and messages delivered through the program activities? And so these are the kinds of questions you want to be considering. What messages are being communicated by the content in this program? What knowledge is being increased? What skills are being developed? This can all help inform the development of a logic model if it doesn't already exist. The other element that they think is important to think through is the how. So again, the delivery. How is this being delivered? How should it be delivered? How was it originally delivered? What are the recommended methods, teaching methods? How many sessions, for how long, for what period of time, what setting best supports learning. So that's the kind of how aspect of key elements. And then finally, the who. So what are the characteristics of who should be ideally delivering the program? What skills and experiences are really critical for them to deliver the essential content of the curriculum? What characteristics help the facilitator be successful? So if you don't already have access to an existing logic model for a program, these are the kinds of things you want to be talking about, looking for in the materials you do have access to help build out your understanding of how this program works and what the underlying theory is to this particular program. Fortunately, for strengthening families, we were able to kind of take advantage of already existing resources. So this is a program logic model that was developed out of Penn State University, but it is in alignment with how we've been implementing and delivering SFP for many years in Washington State as well. So this gives you kind of the high level overview of what are the core program components, what are they trying to target, what kinds of outcomes are they trying to target, that sort of thing. This is useful, but still not a lot to go off in terms of what are the key elements. This is actually the other part of the logic model, the more detailed aspect of the logic model that gets quite a bit more detailed about how these different components go together. But the part I want you to focus in on is this part. So obviously this was also kind of replicated or shown on the other version of the logic model. But here we see that the core components are the fact that we have both parents and youth. We have parent sessions where parents on their own are accomplishing different activities and working together, youth separately in another session, and then they come together for a family session. So just as like a really, I think, straightforward example, for Strengthening Families program, one consideration might be, well, it's too long. The parents don't want to stick around or kids aren't interested in staying for the full amount of time. So let's just cut the family sessions. I would say, hey, no, red light, stop. We can't do that. That's really a core element to this program when the youth and the family and the parents come together, or the caregivers come together and work together on a particular topic. The other thing you'll notice here are what we call the program modalities. So the specific strategies, methods, and techniques that are being used to accomplish these program goals. And you can see they're very interactive. There's lots of different types. There are videos, there are discussions, there are role plays. There's a meal, that's a core element for this program. There are games, different things that are more than just didactic presentation of information. So we wanted to maintain and adhere to all these really important core elements when thinking about moving forward with our adaptations. So we're at this step where we're assessing the need for adaptation. So this is going to seem kind of maybe somewhat repetitive, but we got a lot more detailed information through this process as well. So again, the mismatch being, there's no explicit information about cannabis, especially within the context of legalized adult use in the curriculum, the existing curriculum. So we thought, okay, that's maybe a potential mismatch, but let's go to our target audiences. Let's talk to experienced SFP 10 to 14 facilitators who've been implementing the program recently in Washington State. Let's go to participants, so caregivers who've gone through the program recently, and talk to them about the potential needs for this, what we think might be an adaptation related to this new context that we're living in. We also went to the literature. So as researchers, as scientists, we often go to, well, what does the research say on whatever a question is? So for this one, we were actually looking at what does the research say are ineffective elements of substance use prevention programs? We don't want to inadvertently make an adaptation that actually research shows might increase the likelihood of negative outcomes or no outcomes at all. So those are the two key pieces that we engaged in order to assess the need for adaptation. So what we learned when we went to the caregivers and the facilitators supported our kind of initial thought was that they were interested in the addition of cannabis-specific content. Facilitators requested additional information on cannabis and aids to support the content of the sessions that already existed. And caregivers expressed needing help communicating with youth about cannabis. Along this, like I said, alongside these focus groups, we also conducted this review of the literature to identify elements of ineffective youth substance use prevention programs. And what we found in that review of literature is that, I'll just share briefly, improving knowledge of substances alone, ineffective. Resistance skills training in the absence of social norms training, ineffective. Stressing drug knowledge on its own, ineffective. Cognitive learning and fact retention, or that more didactic kind of lecturing, not effective if you want behavior change. So you're probably likely familiar with those ineffective components as well, but we wanted to keep those in our mind as we were assessing the need and making decisions about adaptations. So that gets us to actually making our adaptations. And so I'm gonna provide you with examples of two different ideas that we had initially after we came away from those focus groups and did the literature review. So our first idea was, okay, so caregivers are asking for this information, facilitators think it's needed. As I think I mentioned, or you might have seen on the logic model, SFP 10 to 14 is 7 sessions, once a week for seven weeks generally. And so it's a fairly lengthy curriculum already, but we thought, well, maybe we just add a new session at the very end, focused solely on cannabis use. Well, after thinking it through a little bit more, we had some concerns. We thought, well, maybe that extends the length of the program too much, and that might increase participant burden, and participants might be more likely to drop out. Then we had some concerns about youth being exposed to cannabis-specific information. As we were talking about, an ineffective element that the literature said is increasing drug knowledge on its own is not a very effective, and in fact is an ineffective strategy. So we were like, oh, maybe not. Maybe this, especially for the youth, that might not be the way to go. So that's those were our initial concerns. But I'm curious if you're using this kind of green light, yellow light, red light. In the chat box, I'm going to ask you just to share your thoughts. Do you think, based on what I'm describing here, is this green light, yellow light, or red light adaptation? So we're adding a new session at the end, focused solely on cannabis use. Right? Okay, Heather thinks it's red light. Danielle thinks yellow light, Ramona, okay. Some yellows, some reds. Okay, so nobody's saying green light. So we're in consensus there. So great. Yeah, I would agree with you. I would think that it's, we thought it was a yellow light adaptation. So there, a yellow light. One, because we're adding material. But it's yellow light because we're like, oh, it might not be quite in alignment with what the literature says is effective. So this is the point at which you might move to that decision-making tool that from the MADI that we talked about earlier. So we might go through this process and say, okay, well, is my adaptation that I just mentioned, that additional session, is it systematic? I would say yes. We went through a systematic process to come to that idea of an adaptation. Is it designed with a goal in mind? Yeah, it is. It's designed with the goal of improving, or improving the fit of the program within the context of legalized cannabis use for adults. Is it aligned with the core functions? Maybe you might have some questions about that, but in general, we said yes. Okay, so are there any negative impacts on outcomes, either intended or unintended? This, we think, yeah, maybe. There might be some negative impacts. We already discussed what some potential concerns would be around youth having an entire session on solely focused on cannabis use. Are there ways to offset that? And we kind of thought, well, maybe not really. I mean, yes, if we modify this modification, but we said, okay, let's just abandon this idea and kind of redesign the adaptation. So that's how we moved forward. So we came to adaptation idea number 2. We thought, well, instead of lengthening kind of the number of sessions or the number of weeks, we thought maybe there'd be a way to kind of enhance each individual session by just a little bit. So adding 15 minutes to each session, was an idea we came up with in consultation with facilitators who thought, oh, that would be feasible and I think a little bit more acceptable to families. So we also distinguished what the types of content we were going to be adding to caregiver sessions versus youth sessions. Caregivers, we felt confident, and this is what they told us, was that they were really interested in cannabis-specific content, whereas we were worried about the youth, so we wanted to make that a little bit broader, not so specific to cannabis use, but more broadly, you know, basically in alignment with what substance use prevention programs do already, which is increasing the decision-making skills and the peer resistance skills and improving coping skills, things that are going to hopefully prevent youth from using substances. So we're going to kind of enhance those aspects that we think are effective already. So again, based on just my brief description of those adaptations, would you say these adaptations are green, yellow, or red light adaptations? Okay, so I got some green lights, some yellow. Yeah. Yellow, but leaning to green. Great. Okay. Yeah. So I think we're still in the yellow zone. That was how we were thinking about it. We're like, okay, we're adding content to try to enhance already existing aspects of the program. But we're still a little cautious about it. They're not minor changes. We're not just changing the name of the program, right? We're adding content. So we felt like, okay, we need to be cautious as we proceed. So something that we used importantly to guide the what we added to these sessions, we wanted to make sure that any new content or resources we added were in alignment with the content for that session. So SFP already has a structure for like the topics they're going to cover in each session. We didn't want this added 15 minutes to be totally, you know, in a different area. Like we wanted to maintain that kind of consistency. We also wanted to add the content in alignment with the feedback we received. Right, so we talked to a handful of caregivers, a handful of facilitators who wanted to make sure the changes were in alignment with those. Also wanted to make sure that these additions did not include elements of ineffective programs that were revealed through the literature review. Okay, so again, because it's yellow light, we can kind of use that MADI decision tool to think through this as well. So we said, all right, is the adaptation systematic, designed with the goal, aligned with core functions? We feel fairly confident in yes, it is. And actually, sorry, I didn't mean to even get that far yet. I did want to show you actual examples. So I have a caregiver example and a youth example of what we added in those extra 15 minutes. So session 2 for caregivers, the focus of that session already is on making house rules. So we added the 15 minutes related to safe storage and disposal of cannabis and house rules regarding cannabis safety. So if you choose to have cannabis in your house, here are some ways to safely store it and make sure that your youth don't get access to it. So that's a really specific cannabis-specific material that we added onto a session that was already talking about making house rules. For session 3, in the youth session, the focus is on dealing with stress. So we added 15 minutes related to decision-making and normalizing non-drug use, again, more broadly applicable to substance use prevention. And we borrowed, I think, an activity from our existing program or we had experience with, and it's called the Coping Choices Tool. It's an actual, I don't know if you guys did fortune tellers when you were younger. We made those little things. And so it's these fortune tellers that have different healthy choices to help prompt, you know, better decisions around coping. And they actually had to practice with that tool in these different scenarios. So that's an example of that adaptation. So again, we thought this is a systematic adaptation. We're doing a good job of maintaining and aligning with core functions. Then we had to think through, are there any potential negative impacts on the outcomes? We didn't think so. We thought that this was fairly aligned. We couldn't really think of any potential negative impacts. So we felt fairly confident moving forward with this adaptation. And that brings us to kind of the final best practice, which is all about documenting and monitoring, and the other kind of recommendation that the MADI decision framework points us to is that you can't just stop there. You have to kind of monitor and document. So we're in the midst of this. I don't have any details to share yet, but we are piloting these adaptations currently and asking, when do people call you? Seriously, sorry. So that's in a work in progress, and I'd love to come back and share what we learn, but we're not quite there yet. So I think I did a pretty good job of sticking to time. We have about 10 minutes left. This is all the content I wanted to share with you. So at this point, I'm really just opening it up for broader discussion and comments and questions. I have some questions here. So, if you have questions about our experience, I'd be happy to take those now. And I think at this point, you're welcome to put them in the chat box rather than the Q&A, since we're at this point in the session. I'm also just curious to hear from you how you might envision using these strategies in your own work. Did you come away with like a new idea to try to apply to your particular experience or scenario that you're working through right now? And then I'm also just curious to know, like, is there something missing that you were expecting and hoping to get today that you didn't get? Because that helps me as I continue to refine these materials and present to other groups. And we also we have a brain trust here, so maybe other people have answers to your questions as well. Yeah. So yeah, it's time for just general discussion. Happy to take questions or just hear comments and reactions. Oh, Ramona, yeah, the fortune teller. So I'm using these, I don't know if you can see my fingers, right? They're paper things you fold it up, kind of like origami. You create these little fortune tellers. And if you did them as a child, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And if you didn't, you probably have no idea what I'm talking about. But then the pieces, the paper that you open up to see what's underneath, like you may have 1, 2, 3, 4, and there's this process that you like choose one that they're supposed to brainstorm different healthy coping strategies. So the idea being you can come up with a variety of strategies that you might use in a particular scenario, and they walk them through, once they've made the fortune tellers, how to use them, or it's just like a fun activity, fun game way to be thinking about how you might utilize healthy coping strategies. Yeah, kind of like a magic 8-ball. Yeah, good comparison, Lisa. Great. Yeah, I used to do those in elementary school. Yeah. Kathleen, you asked a question here. As we talk with stakeholders about selection, is it a good idea to emphasize that it can be adapted? Great question. I mean, from my perspective, I would say yes, within some boundaries, right? So, I mean, I think you don't want to suggest that you can completely change everything about the program. Certainly that wouldn't be the goal, hopefully. But that there are ways that you can thoughtfully adapt to improve fit to a particular community and better engage your audience, and maybe also improve fit to whatever the capacity is of a particular organization within reason. And that's the hard part, is figuring out where that line is. Yeah. And Kathleen, I think that tool, the hexagon tool from NIRN, N-I-R-N, that I included on the program selection page, that's a really good tool to use multiple stakeholders. They actually walk you through, they have surveys or ratings that you do for these different dimensions. And they encourage you to have multiple people involved in this. So getting different perspectives. I think that would be an excellent way to talk them through that, to number one, choose a program that's the best fit, and then also point you to where you might need to make or want to make adaptations. So Danielle says, I want to bring a process to making adaptations to my team. So this is very helpful to understand, in the process to help make change rather than just making changes willy-nilly. Yay, that makes me very happy. Thank you, Danielle. Great. Any other questions? I'm going to look at Patty or just ask. We have about 5 minutes left, so I want to make sure I'm giving you time if you need time at the very end. The only other thing I was going to share, one, I was going to ask you if we met this goal, but I feel confident we're at about at least 80%, so that's great. And then I did include a couple of slides at the end for additional information and resources. I point you to another role that I play is with the Prevention Technology Transfer Center. I'm the co-lead for the Northwest, and they have so many resources. I just pulled a handful that I was able to find on this topic. And then there's one coming up that's going to be happening live if you're interested in this particular intervention, adapting it, working with Hispanic families. So if you're not already on email listservs for your local regional PTTC, please feel free to join those listservs, because they're really great resources being provided. And then, as promised, cultural adaptations, if you're interested in those, I really encourage you to take a look at these articles. Yeah. You're welcome, and I'll stop sharing. So, Patty, anything else?
No, Brittany, there were just a couple of last questions. So one was, well, this will be a quick one. The red light, yellow light, the traffic light. basically part. Was that within one of the resources that you shared?
Yeah.
If not, I can pull that out and make sure we include it in the resource supplement to everybody.
So I'm gonna find the link really quickly. So this comes from a document. Let's see, there we go. It's called Implementation Science at a Glance, a guide for cancer control practitioners. So again, a little bit of a different audience, but still very relevant. And there's a specific section on adaptation, and that's where I pulled that image from. So yeah, check that out. But I think, sorry, the CDC also talks about green light, yellow light, red light, and that's maybe even more close to the context of substance use prevention.
Great. Claudia had just asked a follow-up question regarding when you're talking about adapting EVPs using best practices, what exactly do we mean by using best practices? So the processes you shared with us would be those best practices.
Yeah, so in the document that I helped create, that's what we talk about, those 5, the image with the 5 different steps or practices, those are what I would consider best practices. Yeah.
Now, Brittany, you all are come from an academic background. For many of our prevention practitioners, they do not. So if they were struggling with how do I go about this process, how do I do a focus group even, how would I follow these steps? What suggestions might you provide to them to help them through these processes?
Well, I should say too that I'm definitely come from the academic side, the research side, but I work closely with practitioners and people who, for SFP, worked really closely with people who are trained to facilitate and implement those programs. So I think that what we developed in, and again, I'll just post this since I have the time right now, the document that we developed is really targeted at practitioners. So we try to distill down and talk about these concepts in ways, and in fact, one of the authors on this, Ana Maria Diaz-Martinez, she's a master trainer in SFP and really a practitioner academic, I would say. And so she really helped us think through what are realistic, both processes and steps, and what are some realistic scenarios. So throughout this document, we actually, for each of the best practices, we talk about a scenario to get you thinking about if you found yourself in this scenario, how would you make your decision, or what would you do given this best practice? And so, yeah, really just trying as best as we can to translate what the research suggests, but also talk to people who are implementing programs and what challenges they're having and what successes they're having, and learning from that as well. Yeah. Oh, you're on mute, Patty.
I was gonna say, I've not seen any final questions, although there has been a steady stream of gratitude for all of the resources that you have shared. So we're incredibly grateful as well. Thank you so much for joining us today to share all of these helpful resources. And for everyone who's attended, thank you so much for your engagement. As you continue to generate follow-up questions, you can certainly reach out to us, and we're happy to help support you in this process and get you connected with any additional resources that you may find beneficial. So we're going to go ahead and wrap there. This recording is going to be sent, just as a reminder, to everybody with a resource supplement with many of the links, as well as that were talked about today, as well as the presentation slides. So once we end the webinar, just to be aware, an evaluation will appear. Let us know how we did today, and also let us know what else you might need around this topic. And if you want CEs, be sure to let us know that whenever you complete those questions. So thanks, everyone. We wish you a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
Take care.